Thanks, Sue, for that introduction. So in this session, I'm just going to challenge you to think a little bit differently about research briefs. So I guess thinking about where this came from, and it's a new year, so like many of you, I've been on a healthy eating initiative. Now, when you try and be that disciplined, inevitably you start craving all unhealthy foods, regardless of whether you'd usually eat them. So every pizza leaflet that's come through the post or McDonald's golden arches spotted in the different distance, I craved it. Now, being a researcher, this got me thinking. Now, all those fast food options have actually got quite a lot in common with many of the research briefs I've worked on in the past. So in this session, I wanted to share with you 3 key ways that I think that research briefs are like takeaway food, which will hopefully give you a bit of a new perspective which to consider the briefs that you either work on or write in the future. So firstly, think about, have you ever had a time when you've been so hungry that you've ordered a huge burger, pizza, or a whole bucket of fried chicken, and then found that you can't finish it all? Well, in a similar way, thinking about research, I find that briefs often contain a number of big questions. Now, those might be a large volume of questions or questions that are quite wide in their scope. And it can be really tempting to try and answer all of those questions, but I often find it's best to focus on a few key elements or questions within the brief to tackle and just be open with your clients about what you can and can't feasibly answer within the scope. And that's typically your combination of timings and budget that you have available. Now, if you do need to revise the scope, then it's always good practice to reconfirm that with your key stakeholders, just to make sure that everyone's aligned. So next I wanted to discuss expectations versus reality. Now, without fail, every time I have McDonald's, or as I'm based in Australia, Macca's, the reality is always really different to my expectations. And when I was working on some recent briefs, I was thinking, well, these briefs are often quite different sometimes than you might expect. You might find that the underlying challenges the business faces are different or more complex than perhaps you initially thought. And then often the insights that come out of that research project can be multi-dimensional, and they kind of reveal a finding or an insight that you perhaps didn't expect. And that's where a really solid but also flexible analysis plan or framework, whatever you usually use, really comes in useful. And I guess the key here is to have some kind of structured, methodical approach to your analysis. So, for example, if you tend to use a hypothesis-based approach, then key questions from the brief will have associated hypotheses with them. And these will be testable. So as something unexpected in the analysis process potentially comes to light, you can then shift to explore that new direction and develop some new hypotheses. And I guess it's also worth noting here that the hypotheses you develop or that your client initially has might be wrong. So you might really need to challenge those. So in summary here, it's important to be open to changes in the direction that your research may take and make sure that you're flexible enough to adapt to those as you go along. And finally, I wanted us to consider is, well, when thinking about one of my favorite things about takeaway pizza, that's got to be the ability to change the toppings to your preference. And that could typically be half and half or even completely custom. So you can tailor it to the demands of each consumer. And what I find in a similar way is that often a research brief requires a mix of approaches to fully answer the objectives within them. This might involve a mix of quant and qual methods, or desk and primary research, or thinking about the work that we do, analysis of claimed versus actual behaviour. And to truly uncover those insights, it's likely to require a mix of approaches and always a custom approach to each client's needs. And it might be that actually to fully answer that brief, then you need to partner with another company or agency who specialises in a certain methodology, or to reach a particular niche sample, for example. So in summary, I've found that takeaway food has quite a lot in common with the research briefs I've worked on in the past. And I wanted to leave you with 3 key takeouts. So firstly, focus on the elements of the brief that you and your organisation can feasibly answer within the scope, and just be really clear about what that revised scope looks like. So secondly, be open to outcomes and insights that you might not be expecting. And as I mentioned previously, this may involve challenging your client's own hypotheses that they hold. And finally, you'll likely need to use a customized or mixed methodology approach to really fully answer your client's objectives from that brief. So thanks for listening. Feel free to get in touch with your thoughts or connect with me on Twitter, and I'll pass back to Sue for some questions.
Thank you, Emma.